And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Ron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Culver. Our goal for each episode each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body in the process. This is our 16th episode in our Journey Through the Scripture series. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find this linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com. That's roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit more about ourselves, the genesis for our podcast name, and provide several helpful resources to help you dig further into redemptive history, no matter where you are on your journey. From time to time, Kid and I will also respond to direct questions that you as listeners send us at our email address, which is contact@roadfromemmaus.com. That's contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast so that you receive notifications for all of our fresh content. We drop a new episode every Monday, so we look forward to you taking this exciting ride through the scriptures with us. Just to recap where we were last time, I think it's important to note too that even as we wrapped up the Exodus, the Israelite people kind of in on this high point of exaltation. But one of the things that Kit and I are really going to unpack today too is that we need to remember that the Exodus was really an expression of God's covenant faithfulness too, not necessarily Israel's. And at the end of the day, what we're going to unpack over the next several weeks is to show that the Israelites people in a corporate sense, that their hearts had not changed towards the Lord, and that what the implications are that, and our push for that to actually, for God to still resolve the tension, right? The fact too is that their hearts need to be changed, the fact that they need to be fully devoted to them, but that would not happen in a transactional sense too. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into episode 16 too. Israel departed from the Red Sea full of joy and hope, having just watched their God deliver them from the Egyptian taskmasters through a mighty and terrifying act of supernatural power. We're actually going to dig in a little bit and take a closer look at the Song of Moses, which celebrated this deliverance and its goal in Exodus 15, 1 through 18. But no sooner did they set out on their exultant joy and praise, turn to unbelief, resentment, and grumbling, which only grew worse over the next 3 months until they arrived at Sinai. Kit, talk a little bit about that. And I know we're going to dig a little back into the Song of Moses to kind of do some connective tissue work there too, but kind of frame that context for us and why it's so critical for us to understand that, especially as we unpack this transition from the Exodus as we move towards Sinai.
Right. Well, I think it's easy for us, particularly as we read through the Old Testament, we can kind of just see a bunch of stories or incidents or circumstances that we tend to just kind of pass over. And certainly, people tend to be anxious to get to Sinai and the covenant at Sinai. And so this is a section in chapters 15 through 18 that people easily kind of bypass or just read through very lightly. But it is very important in building the case again that brings us to Sinai. Recall again that God's deliverance out of Egypt represented his faithfulness to the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had sent Moses as his deliverer because he was the God of the fathers. He remembered his covenant, and he was going to uphold that covenant with Abraham's descendants. So the Exodus represented that kind of climactic act of God's faithfulness to the covenant and to the people of the covenant. And immediately after bringing them out, they have this kind of climactic deliverance at the Red Sea where Pharaoh's army and the power of Egypt is destroyed. And Israel observes this. They're brought through on dry land, and then the waters collapse and destroy the army of Egypt. And they commemorate this in an exultant way with this thing that is called one of the songs of Moses that comes up here in this passage. And immediately from this high point of celebration and confidence in their God and his covenant faithfulness, the text immediately turns to their departure from the Red Sea, and within 3 days, this first incident of testing takes place. But just to kind of capture that a little bit, this is the end of the Song of Moses, this kind of exultant high point in the song. This is what they say to Yahweh, to the God who's delivered them. You will bring your people and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your dwelling. The sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. Yahweh, the Lord, the God of Israel will reign forever and ever. So the punctuation mark on this song is their absolute confidence that the God who has brought them out of Egypt, brought them through the Red Sea, will bring them to the land that he has promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not just as a land, but as the place where God himself dwells, his sanctuary. So God will indeed gather his people to himself to be with him where he is. That's the high point of this Song of Moses. And then immediately, 3 days into the wilderness, they're thirsty, they're looking around, they don't find any water, and now they begin to question God's faithfulness. Here they've just said, you will bring us, you will plant us, you will dwell with us as you promised. Now they're saying, oh, why did you bring us out here to die? So these tests become a testing of Israel's integrity and faithfulness to the covenant, and also the way in which God demonstrates over and over again to them that he does indeed remain faithful. This is kind of a very short quote from Bruce Waltke talking about this series of 5 tests, this passage of time. It's basically 3 months from the deliverance out of Egypt in the Red Sea episode till they arrive at Sinai, where God now enters into this covenant with them. So this 3-month interval of testing, Waltke writes, on this journey, Israel tests God and finds their covenant-keeping God to be a faithful provider, but he does not find similar faith in them. Instead, they are revealed to be unfaithful covenant keepers. Not only do they not trust him to bring them to the sworn land, but some of them also refuse to obey his commands. As ancient Near Eastern suzerainty treaties show, murmuring against a ruler is the beginning of sedition. And so by the time they arrive at Sinai, ready to enter into this covenant, it's already clear to us, the readers who are reading this storyline, that Israel is not going to be faithful to this covenant. They were not faithful in Egypt. They are not faithful in the 3 months leading to Sinai. And we have every reason to believe that even though they will bind themselves to God in this covenant, they will not adhere to it. And that becomes a huge issue in the developing storyline beyond that, because Israel must hold to its obligation under the covenant in order for God's purposes for the world of men and for his creation to be realized. So these tests are very important in framing at the outset Israel's relationship with God as they prepare to enter into formal covenant relationship with him.
Indeed. Kit, speak a little bit too, because we've already talked about this brief interval. And obviously, if you want to dig into a little bit more, that's Exodus 15:22 and through 18:27, that it highlights those 5 distinct tests. What were those specific tests? And then how did they relate to one another, Kit, too? I think that's something our listeners are maybe have never obviously read through this story too. It's very well known, this episode, right? We've seen Hollywood kind of do its own representation of a lot of these things too. But a lot of the granular details and stuff that you've obviously spoken to, I think have been glossed over. Help us kind of unpack that a little bit, and then just how these tests tie together, and then maybe the long-term implications of where those are pushing.
Okay. Well, again, it's important to keep these specific incidences in their larger historical and covenantal context, because they're not just independent little episodes. Oh, you're out in the wilderness. Oh, you find there's nothing to drink, and they're unhappy with God. And God says, well, here's something to drink. Okay, that's great. Let's move on. These are all to be read and understood in terms of, again, what Israel is in relation to God and God's purposes in and through them for the sake of the world. This first test occurs as they leave from the Red Sea. They enter into the wilderness of Shur. And the text says they went 3 days away, just 3 days into the wilderness, and found no water. And they come to this place called Mara. They could not drink the waters of Mara, for they were bitter. The waters were, for whatever reason, not drinkable, whether through minerals or whatever it happened to be. So they're grumbling at Moses, and Moses cries to the Lord, and there's this kind of supernatural thing where Moses finds this tree and he throws it in the water, and the waters are sweetened, meaning that they are made palatable, made drinkable, so that the people can now drink the water. But the text says there the Lord made for them a statute and a regulation, and he tested them there. Well, what is that statute and regulation? Moses didn't write down, some new laws or something like that. But here's the statute and regulation. This is the essence of what God wanted them to take away from this. If you will give earnest heed to the voice of Yahweh your God, and you will do what is right in his sight, give ear to his directives, keep all of his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. And they departed from there and came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the water. So the text wants us to see that Israel is now questioning God's faithfulness. Is he going to do what he said? Well, he provides for them in a supernatural way. He takes that which they can't, drink of, and he makes it so that they can drink it and be satiated. But he says, this is a test for you. You have to trust me. You have to follow me. You have to heed to my word. And if you will do that, then just as I healed these waters, so also my healing will be upon you, and it will go well for you. And then he leads them from there to an oasis where there's an abundance to eat and to drink. And so he shows them, if you'll just trust me, if you'll follow me, if you'll heed my word, then it will go well for you. You saw what I did to the Egyptians. And, later on, obviously, this will end with Israel being confronted with blessings and cursings based on covenant obedience and faithfulness. Even physical diseases, barrenness, fruitfulness of their crops, continuance in the land, all of these things, these blessings will come to them if they will simply be faithful to the Lord and to the relationship that he's establishing with them. So this kind of lays the foundation. And then, we see the next thing with the issue of no food to eat, and the introduction of the manna and God providing quail to them. And then another incident of thirstiness and questioning God, and Moses saying, they're about to kill me. I don't know if I can take more of this. So there's a progress and an escalation in these tests as well, which finally then lead us to the foot of Sinai in chapter 19.
Kid, I think it's interesting too that one of the things, and I want to bring it back full circle, that we lose sight of is that God viewed and perceived Israel as covenant son,
Right,
albeit an unfaithful son. And one of the ways that a son reflects sonship is being fully devoted, right, to the
right,
father too, and also dependent upon the father. And so one of the things I'm hearing as you're talking through the test is, yes, we can look at those as like addressing felt needs or whatever, but really the
right,
undercurrent through all of them too is God is showing not only the need and necessity for a son to be dependent and devoted to the father, but also it exposes their inability to actually fulfill that too, through the grumbling, right? Through the shortcuts, through their lack of covenant unfaithfulness. They are showing too, in many respects too, is that we are not up to this task. We are not faithful son, though you have called us son. And I think what it does in our mind is it creates a tension. Lord, if they're not faithful, if they're counterfeit in many respects, how are you going to resolve that? Speak to that a little bit, Kit, because I think in light of things, we focus so much on corporate Israel that we forget that God is interacting and engaging with them as a son.
Right. And there is a lot in what you've just said. I think, maybe a starting place is this idea of our natural tendency to read things like this as, oh, God will meet your whether felt needs or actual physical needs. Oh, you
Right.
don't need to worry. God will always give you water to drink, and he'll always give you food to eat, and he'll provide for your needs. But again, that kind of puts this in this context of it really being all about us, and so we tend to say, okay, God loves this people, Israel. He's going to meet their needs. He's going to give them what they need as they're moving through the wilderness. But it's important to remember that God's love for Israel, as it were, is tied to and the fleshing out of this purpose for the world and for the larger creation. So when Israel is, in a sense, doubting that God will provide for their needs or grumbling and complaining, really the implication is that they're disbelieving God as the God of all creation, as the God of the world. They're disbelieving that God will, in fact, do what he has said he's going to do. He has covenanted and determined to do that work in and through Abraham and Abraham's descendants, so that it is about them, but it's about them as they are the instrument for a larger program. So if God is not faithful to Israel, then by implication, he's not faithful to himself. He's not faithful to the world. He's not faithful to his creation. And so Israel's sonship sits at the very center of that. Israel is son for the sake of the world. As you said, a son is of the Father. When you see the Son, you see the Father. When the Son is faithfully executing his, identity and his role. So Israel is to be the light of the nations. Recall again, the Abrahamic promise was that through you and through your descendants, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Well, how is the Lord's blessing going to come to all the families of the earth? It will be by coming to observe and know the God of all mankind, the God of all creation, through the faithfulness of the people that he set apart. If Israel will fulfill its sonship, then it will be the light of the nations. It will be the ones through whom this creator God of all mankind will be made known to all the families of the earth. So the implications of Israel's faithfulness and their disbelieving God, and on the other side, the implications of God's continued faithfulness, is more than just about how he feels about these particular individual people. It's really about his integrity, his commitment to his purposes for this world that he's created.
Yeah, like I love that. And I think our listeners are probably reeling a little bit too, where their disbelief was actually calling God fraudulent about his pride,
Exactly.
his promise to just not only actually address their specific needs, but we have to keep in mind he has always had cosmic intention and focus. And so I think when you almost turn the mirror on Israel, and it's like when you reject these things and you do not live into and embrace your own sonship, you are actually calling into question the very things that God said he not only will promise and do, but actually do through you. And I think
Right.
that creates this amazing, for lack of a better term, narrative tension that we see God has to resolve, and we know God will resolve in Jesus as we move through as well. Kit, you've already spoken a little bit about this, and I think this is such an exciting follow-up. How are these tests significant, not just as individual physical tests? And Kit, I think you've already done a great job of naming that. I think we see the physical intention and focus of them: food, water, right? Living
Right.
circumstances, right? We call it standard of living, so to speak, here in modern society. But in terms of their historical and covenant context, and then maybe even more importantly, Kit, what did they reveal about the true nature of Israel's relationship with God in contrast to his unfailing commitment to them, which I think we've already spoken about a little bit, if you could stamp that.
Sure. Well, again, as Waltke said, what these tests are really doing, it, they're fleshing out in time and space this relationship between God and the Israelite people. Remember, after those centuries in Egypt, they had forgotten the Lord. Both Joshua, Ezekiel talk about they had actually embraced the gods of Egypt. They had departed from, if you will, their election and their calling while they were in Egypt. And so God has to, in a sense, reintroduce himself to them. He makes himself known to them in Egypt. He brings them out and he expresses to them that this is about me remembering. You've forgotten, but I've remembered my covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now is the time for me to fulfill this promise that I had even articulated to Abraham, that I would bring his descendants out with a great deliverance and they would plunder their captors and come out in a triumphal way. Well, now is that time. And that's the setting in which these tests are taking place. And so you have a relationship that God has established covenantally with Abraham and his descendants, and God has to bring these Israelites back into the sense of that covenant relationship and their own place in his purposes. And part of that reestablishing, or in their case, establishing that relationship for the first time in their experience after these centuries in Egypt, part of that, this is who I am, this is who you are, establishing of that relationship, is God showing that he will be faithful. He has to prove to them that he will indeed do what he says. Now they've celebrated and seen this great, cataclysm at the Red Sea and said, oh yes, he will bring us into his land. He will establish us in his sanctuary, but they don't really believe it. They don't know what that's going to entail. And they certainly don't understand that there's going to be difficulty, hardship, challenges along the way through which they will see their God prove faithful, but through which also they must prove faithful.
Mhm.
And in fact, they won't prove faithful. And so this whole dynamic of the relationship between God and Israel, again, Israel being the Abrahamic people, the ones through whom God's purposes for all the world are bound up, the one through whom he will accomplish these purposes. The tension of that dynamic of the faithful God versus the unfaithful covenant son becomes the center of the whole Old Testament story that ultimately leads us to the coming of Christ himself, who shows himself to be the faithful son, servant, disciple, witness to the nations, the one through whom Israel, as the Abrahamic seed, becomes Israel indeed. And so that now Israel's own role, because covenants require things of both parties, right?
Mhm.
The fulfillment of the covenant demands that God be faithful, but also Israel must be faithful if God's oath to Abraham is to be ultimately realized. And that all lies behind and kind of frames these tests and the reader's understanding of the significance of them. It's not just, again, oh, I'm thirsty. Will God give me something to drink? It's much, much more significant and profound than that.
Kid, I think to maybe even highlight the gravitas of it, maybe saying it in the negative, if Israel is not Israel, God's cosmic purposes will not be accomplished. I
Exactly.
think when we say it like that, it's like, well, dang, like that seems like it's all on Israel, but that only ultimately shows and it helps us understand how vital Israel to this. What we need to unpack and define for people is what does God mean by Israel? And obviously, as we go through this
Right.
journey, we'll start to flesh in and fill in that container. But I think so often when you say things in the negative, it heightens and helps people understand how central Israel is to this redemptive, not only the narrative kit, but to the cosmic fulfillment of everything that God has promised going back to the garden, which is why we're so critical in pushing our readers, excuse me, our listeners to understand that yes, we know about Jesus, but even Jesus starts with creation, and we
Right.
must start there and rightly understand everything that's bound up in that as we understand this narrative as a whole.
Right. Right. No, it's absolutely the case. And, we've pushed on this thing of thinking about Israel as a concept,
Mhm.
and that's very much at the center of all of this. It's not that they weren't an actual people or whatever, but again, even Paul recognized, he says, when God made his promises to Abraham and his seed, which we say, okay, well, that's the people of Israel. Well, Paul says, actually, that promise was about one seed. who is the Messiah himself. And so Paul came to recognize that all that Israel was, all that it signified, all that it was in God's purposes, all that it was covenantally, and as the Abrahamic people, all of that had its yes and amen in Jesus himself. So it means that we have to see Israel in the light of its destiny being fulfilled in the Messiah, but we also have to see the Messiah as the one who is the embodiment of this thing we call Israel. If we don't get those things right, then we don't understand either one of them.
Indeed. And like I love your push kit too, where this is a both and not a either or. Both of these
Right.
realities must be true and be true at the same time for us to really have a proper framework for this whole thing that is happening. I love it too.
Right.
Kid, as we wrap today too, we would like to do the following. Consider that God used the provision of manna to introduce the Sabbath principle and obligation to Israel too. This is Exodus 16. Looking back to the original creation and forward to the law of Moses and its various Sabbath ordinances, how does this framework inform our understanding of Israel and its role as a Sabbath people on behalf of the world? And before you answer, Kid, I just want to remind our listeners that when we're talking about Sabbath, we're not talking about a prescriptive law or whatever. We're talking about a way of life, a way of thinking, just as we really think redemptive historically about these principles too. Can you speak to those questions?
Sure. And there's really obviously a lot in that, but I think if we can remind folks where we were back in this original Sabbath idea in the garden, after God completes his work, he enters into his rest. And we have to understand again that what's being depicted there is the creator sovereign who is ordering and filling his creation. He's bringing order and fullness out of disorganized, chaotic creational existence. And that's what a wise, good, just ruler would do. He would bring order and harmony and fullness to his kingdom. And when that king had accomplished that work, that ruler, he would take his seat on his throne, he would take his rest on his throne, which meant that he was now undertaking his administration of this ordered, harmonized, filled domain or kingdom that he had put in place. So the idea of rest or Sabbath isn't about napping or not doing anything or taking it easy. It's really the activity of administering that order that has now been put in place. And that's what's lost in a sense, because that seventh day, remember, was a perpetual sabbatical existence. As you said, God is now administering his rule. Well, how is he going to do that? He's going to do that through the image son, the priest king that he has created. That's what Genesis 1 and 2 wants us to understand. Well, now all that's gone south with the fall. And so the calling of Abraham and the bringing of the human race back to God through Abraham is really about getting that program of Sabbath, of God administering his ordered, harmonized, filled creation, him administering that reign through his human creature, through the priest, king, image, son that he has created. And so Israel, as we'll see, is to be that. God's going to establish a kingdom with Israel. And at the center of that will be this Sabbath principle, because Yahweh's going to take up his reign on his throne amongst his people. And Israel, as we'll see when they get to Sinai, they are to be a royal priesthood. They are to be the king priest, a new kind of Adam, as it were, through whom now God will be administering his rest. So with Israel, it's not just going to be about a seventh day Sabbath. Their whole existence is going to be ordered around this principle of Sabbath. But that's introduced here in this second test with the hunger situation where God provides them with manna. And the reason how it's introduced is because God tells them each day, I will give you what you need. There won't be too much, there won't be too little. But if you try to collect it, to store it, it's going to go bad. Every day I will provide what you need. You will live upon me. It will be enough. It won't be too much. It won't be too little. But on the sixth day, there will be twice as much because the next day is a Sabbath. And the people are wondering, okay, why is there twice as much? Well, Moses explains this is because this is on the seventh day, you're not to gather. God will give you for that day of rest. So there's a kind of introducing of this Sabbath principle that's going to be at the center of Israel's relationship with God. And that will come in a more formal way through all of the various Sabbath prescriptions that come through the law of Moses. So, when we tend to focus on one day in seven and keeping the Sabbath or, eternal moral commandment or whatever, we're really missing the point of what Sabbath is really all about, how it fits into God's own relationship with his creation that he administers in and through human beings, how it is that man is to be a Sabbath creature, and how ultimately then this Sabbath rest is realized in Jesus himself, so that in him we enter into the Sabbath of God. Again, these are bigger concepts than simply, oh, God says one day of the week, don't carry anything on your back, or don't cook any food, or don't watch a football game, or whatever. We cheapen and trivialize these things when we look at them in that sort of way. So, but anyway, as you mentioned, this principle of Sabbath as a weekly way for Israel to recognize once again, we are to be these image children, these kings and priests, this royal priesthood through whom Yahweh will now be administering his lordship in the world, ultimately to the end that his blessing will flow out to all the families of the earth.
Indeed. And one thing I want to stamp kit too as we close is that the Sabbath certainly, and not to knock it, especially in the context of the Old Testament, it was an historical ritual and rhythm too, but like we don't want to perceive it as an event. It was actually a way of doing life. And to
Right,
point two is it was rooted in these principles of devotion and dependence upon the Lord, right? And
right,
we've even talked about this idea of sonship too, just nevermore is the son reflective of that sonship than when he actually imitates and he reflects and points to the Father. And in this respect, too, kid, I love what you said is even when I think about the idea of Sabbath, at the end of the day, that needs to be framed in this cosmic
right.
understanding, too, is that this is not just for Israel to find its rest, but that the cosmos itself would actually find its rest in these things as well, too,
Exactly.
but through Israel, too, as the vehicle to accomplish that as well. Kid, if you could have put a bow on this, we've covered a lot of ground the last 25, 30 minutes to speak real quick. What is the headline for people? Because during our next episode, we're going to help people really understand the preparations. We're now going to be at Sinai, this and that. What is the one key headline stamp takeaway from your perspective that people need to hold on to as we continue that kind of like this journey in the wilderness?
Well, I guess I would just want people to keep in front of their minds who this people Israel are, what this is really all about. The Old Testament is largely the story of Israel and its history. And we have to situate all of these things, even these five tests that are taking us from the Red Sea to Sinai. We have to situate all of this Old Testament Israelite history and all of its little stories within this role of Israel, Israel's election as the Abrahamic people, Israel's calling on behalf of the world. So as we're reading these things, we're seeing them through the lens of how it is that God is going to accomplish his purposes for the world, first given to us in a germinal way in the creation account and the structure of that, and how it all comes together, and then the central role of the human image son at the center of that, and then how God establishes this program to make all things right. We have this calamity, the fall, the loss that we see in Genesis 3, and God now has a scheme in place by which to make all things right, centered again in the human creature. And that focus on man as the instrument of God restoring and healing and renewing all things, such that his creation will finally be what he intended it to be, and he will be in relation to it what he intends. As Paul says, God will be all in all. That program that has man at the center, Israel becomes that human entity. They are the seed of Abraham, through whom God will do this work. So we have to view their triumphs and their failures and their life with God, this covenant relationship, and certainly God's interaction with them through that lens. God isn't just simply dealing with one people that he happens to like, or that for whatever reason he's put his attention on. This is about his concern for the world. This is about his concern for the whole creation. And Israel sits at the center of that by divine design. So Israel is to be a new Adam. They are the seed of Abraham. They play that role in the salvation history. And if we don't think of the Israelite people and their history through that lens, then these just become a bunch of kind of arbitrary things that happen, and we can kind of apply it in a moral way or whatever. God fed them, he'll feed us, and we can trust that he'll do that. And we don't really understand the point of all of this.
Man, indeed. We sincerely hope this time you share with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.